There's a moment that reveals everything about power. It's not the moment you win. It's not the moment you fight back. It's the 2 seconds after someone tries to bury you with their presence. The room goes quiet. Their words have landed. Everyone's watching. And in that tiny window, shorter than a heartbeat, you either reach for your composure or you reach for your excuses. Most people grab the wrong thing. They grab defensiveness. They grab sarcasm. They grab a louder voice, hoping volume will disguise the fact that something inside them just tilted off balance. And that tilt, that's what the other person was fishing for all along. Here's what they don't tell you about intimidation. It's not strength leaking out. It's strategy leaking in. Intimidation is a tax on people who don't understand how attention works. The aggressor isn't powerful. They're just spending aggressively, hoping you'll mistake their expenditure for abundance. But what if you could see intimidation for what it actually is? What if you could watch someone try to overwhelm you and feel nothing? Not numbness, not suppression, just genuine stillness while the storm spins a few feet away. That's not fantasy. That's neuroscience. And today, I'm going to show you the architecture underneath it. By the end of this, you won't just have techniques. You'll have a completely different relationship with pressure. You'll understand why some people crumble and some people become more present when the heat turns up. And more importantly, you'll know exactly which one you're training yourself to become. Every human interaction is a transaction of attention. Sounds simple, but most people never truly absorb what this means. When someone tries to intimidate you, they're not actually trying to hurt you, at least not physically. They're trying to capture your attention and then direct it toward your own insecurity. Think about that. The goal isn't to make you fear them. The goal is to make you fear yourself, your inadequacy, your potential failure, your social standing. There's a 2018 study from the Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Journal that tracked brain activity during status challenges. When participants were subjected to aggressive dominance attempts, their anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that detects errors and conflict, lit up like a Christmas tree. But here's the interesting part. In people who had high self-concept clarity, a fancy way of saying they knew who they were, that activation faded quickly. In people with lower self-concept clarity, it spiraled. The intimidator's pressure didn't create the anxiety. It just found it, like water finding cracks in concrete. Imagine your sense of self is a room. Most people have rooms with thin walls. When someone aggressive shows up, they can hear every sound from outside. Every criticism echoes. Every judgment vibrates through the structure. They spend their energy trying to soundproof, defending, explaining, proving. But what if your room had thicker walls? Not rigid, thick, absorbent. The kind of walls that don't echo because they're solid. The difference isn't about becoming cold or untouchable. It's about where your attention lives. When your attention lives in their judgment of you, you're renting space in a building they own. They set the rules. They raise the rent whenever they want. You're always one missed payment from eviction. When your attention lives in your framework, your values, your timing, your assessment of what matters, they're just a visitor. And visitors don't set the thermostat. Here's the counterintuitive piece. This isn't about arrogance. Arrogance is still renting. It's just paying with a different currency. Arrogance says, I'm better than you, which means it still needs you as a reference point. True steadiness doesn't need a comparison. It just is. Think about the calmest person you've ever met. Not the loudest, not the most confident in a performative way. The calmest. What did their presence feel like? I had a mentor once named Catherine who ran a crisis negotiation team for 20 years. She was 5'3", soft-spoken, looked like someone's grandmother. And she could walk into rooms where armed standoffs were happening and have people put their weapons down within minutes. I asked her once what her secret was. She said, I don't need them to do anything. I just need them to feel that I'm not afraid of what they're afraid of. That's it. She wasn't opposing their fear. She was outlasting it. Her attention wasn't on the weapon or the threat. It was on the person's humanity, which is exactly what they'd stopped being able to see in themselves. Your attention is the only resource you truly control. Everything else, your reputation, your relationships, your circumstances, involves other people. But your attention, that's pure sovereignty. And intimidation is just an attempt to seize that sovereignty by making your attention snag on hooks you didn't choose. There's a reason martial arts teach students to breathe before they teach them to punch. Movement without centering is just flailing with extra steps. But here's what most people miss. Stillness isn't the absence of movement. It's the presence of something movement can't touch. In 2015, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh studied how people perceive leaders under stress. They showed participants videos of people responding to challenging questions. Some respondents spoke quickly, gestured frequently, shifted posture often. Others spoke at a measured pace, used minimal gestures, maintained stable positioning. The result? The slower-moving respondents were rated as more intelligent, more trustworthy, and, this is crucial, more likely to be telling the truth. Not because their answers were better, because their presence signaled something that fast. Movement never can. Internal surplus. Fast movement says, I'm running out of time. Slow movement says, I have more than enough. Fast speech says, I need you to hear this before I lose my chance. Slow speech says, this will still be true whether you accept it now or later. Intimidation depends entirely on creating a perceived scarcity of time and status. The aggressor wants you to feel like the window is closing, like you have to prove yourself now. Like if you don't establish your position in the next 10 seconds, you'll lose it forever. That's almost never true. But it feels true when your nervous system is hijacked. Let me tell you about Elena, a corporate lawyer I worked with a few years ago. Elena was brilliant, top of her class, razor-sharp analytical mind. But she kept getting bulldozed in negotiations by opponents who were less prepared but more forceful. They'd interrupt her. They'd raise their voices. They'd lean across tables. And she'd respond by talking faster, explaining more, trying to pack 10 pounds of reasoning into a 5-pound bag. We worked on one thing for 3 months. Not the content of her arguments, but the container they came in. We practiced what she called loading the pause. Instead of answering immediately, she'd take a breath, not a dramatic breath, just a natural one. Instead of filling silence, she'd let it sit for a beat longer than comfortable. Instead of matching their speed, she'd drop her own pace by about 30%. The first time she tried it in a real negotiation, opposing counsel actually stopped mid-sentence and asked if she was okay. She said, "I'm fine. Please continue?" And something in his eyes shifted. He'd lost his footing and didn't know why. Here's the mechanism underneath this. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We have millions of years of evolution dedicated to predicting what happens next. When someone behaves the way we expect, gets loud when provoked, defensive when attacked, our predictions are confirmed, and we continue operating on autopilot. But when someone behaves differently than expected, when they get quieter instead of louder, slower instead of faster, stiller instead of more agitated, the prediction engine sputters. The other person's brain has to shift from automatic processing to manual processing. And manual processing is slower, more effortful, and much harder to maintain while also trying to be intimidating. You're not just being calm, you're forcing them to think, which is exactly what they don't want to do. Intimidation is a shortcut around thinking. Remove the shortcut, and they have to walk the long road. Most of them don't have the legs for it. The person who needs you to react is more dependent on you than you are on them. Your reaction is their fuel. Without it, their engine dies. This means that in any intimidation attempt, the person with the least need for a particular outcome actually has more power, not because they're stronger, Because they're less invested. Think about that the next time someone tries to rush you. Who actually needs something here? Who's actually afraid of silence? Who's actually worried about how this looks? The answers might surprise you. Here's something fascinating about power dynamics. The person asking questions usually has more control than the person giving answers. Think about it. In a job interview, who has the power? The interviewer. They ask, you answer. In a courtroom, who has the power? The lawyer. They question. The witness responds. In a negotiation, the party that can ask, what makes you say that, without defensiveness, is subtly directing traffic. Intimidation thrives on statements. Statements are closed loops. They land and demand response. You're wrong. That won't work. Everyone knows you can't handle this. These aren't invitations to dialogue. They're grenades. The only question is whether you'll try to throw them back or stand there and absorb the blast. But questions? Questions are open loops. They don't demand defense, they demand explanation. And explanation is where intimidation goes to die. When someone makes an aggressive statement, your brain's amygdala, the threat detection center, activates. Blood flows away from your prefrontal cortex, where rational thought lives, and toward your muscles and survival instincts. You literally become dumber in the moment, because your body is preparing for physical combat, even if the threat is purely social. But when you ask a question, genuinely, curiously ask, something different happens. Your brain has to engage its inquiry networks. You have to hold their statement in working memory while you formulate a request for clarification. That cognitive activation actually inhibits the amygdala response. You can't be fully afraid and fully curious at the same time. The circuits compete. Questions are physiological protection. I learned this from a former FBI hostage negotiator named David, who told me that the single most powerful tool in any high-stakes conversation is the phrase, "Help me understand." Not sarcastic, not challenging, genuine. Help me understand why you see it that way. Help me understand what outcome you're really hoping for. Help me understand what information I'm missing. David said that in dozens of hostage situations, this phrase de-escalated more tension than any tactical maneuver, because it does something profound. It signals that you're not threatened enough to need to defend. You're interested, and interest is a higher status position than aggression, because aggression needs a target, while interest just needs information. Let's make this concrete. Your boss says, "This report is unacceptable. You clearly didn't put in the effort." The typical reaction is defensiveness. "That's not fair. I worked all weekend. You don't understand the constraints I was under." That's you trying to win an argument they started. The question frame sounds like this: help me understand what specific part isn't working for you. Notice the difference. In the first response, you're playing their game. In the second, you've changed the game entirely. Now they have to specify. They have to move from emotional judgment to concrete feedback. And if they can't, if they just repeat, "It's just not good enough," their lack of specificity becomes visible. To them, to anyone watching, to themselves. This is the interrogation frame. You become the interviewer of their aggression, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because you understand that vague pressure can't survive precise examination. A friend of mine named Marcus runs a small construction company. He had a client who kept trying to bully him on price, showing up to meetings late, sighing heavily when Marcus gave estimates, saying things like, "I can get 3 other bids by tomorrow, you know." Marcus's old self would have started justifying, explaining material costs, labor rates, why his prices were fair. Instead, he tried the interrogation frame. "I hear that you're concerned about pricing. Walk me through what you're comparing it to." The client stumbled. He hadn't actually gotten other bids. He was just applying pressure. Marcus stayed quiet. The client eventually said, "Well, I just expected it to be lower." Marcus said, "Based on what?" The client said, "I don't know, just lower." Marcus said, So, if I understand correctly, you don't have a specific comparison, but you're hoping there's room to adjust. Is that fair? The client said, "Yeah, I guess so." Marcus then said something brilliant. "I appreciate you being honest about that. Here's what I can do. I'll break down the estimate line by line so you can see exactly where the costs come from. If there's a line item you want to discuss, we'll discuss it. But I won't discount based on a feeling, only based on information. Does that work for you?" The client agreed, not because Marcus caved, but because Marcus turned the conversation from pressure to clarity. And clarity is where real negotiation lives. We like to think we're civilized beings who communicate through words alone. But underneath our language, we're still animals negotiating territory with every inch of our bodies. I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean literally. Your brain has dedicated neural circuitry for tracking physical space, proximity, and positioning. It runs constantly in the background, even when you're not aware of it. And intimidators know how to exploit this circuitry better than you know how to defend it. There's something called the parapersonal space, the bubble of space your brain treats as yours. It extends roughly an arm's length in all directions. Within this space, your brain prepares for different kinds of interaction: touch, intimate conversation, threat response. When someone enters this space without invitation, your nervous system doesn't just notice, it responds. Heart rate changes, muscle tone adjusts, attention narrows. This is automatic. You can't stop it, but you can influence what happens next. Most people, when their space is invaded, do one of two things. They retreat, creating more space, literally stepping back, or they freeze, becoming rigid, hoping the invader will move away. Both responses signal submission to the other person's nervous system. Retreat says, "Your territory is more important than mine." Freezing says, "I'm hoping you'll be nice to me." There's a third option, occupying your space more fully. When someone steps too close, instead of stepping back, you keep your feet planted where they are. You soften your knees slightly. Locking them creates rigidity that reads as fear. You turn your torso to face them squarely. Angle reads as uncertainty. You maintain natural breathing, because shallow breath reads as threat, response. And you let your gaze be steady, but not aggressive. You're not challenging them. You're not moving toward them. You're simply not moving away. You're occupying the space you already occupy, fully and without apology. The effect is remarkable. Most people who use proximity as intimidation have never encountered someone who simply stays. They're expecting the backward shuffle. When it doesn't come, their brain sends an error signal. Something's wrong. The script isn't working. They often step back themselves, unconsciously, to re-establish the distance their intuition says should exist. This isn't about being intimidating yourself. It's about being immovable, which is a completely different quality. A 2019 study in the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior examined how people perceive different responses to spatial invasion. Participants watched videos of interactions where one person stepped close and the other either retreated, froze, or held ground. The held ground respondents were rated as significantly more confident and competent, even when their facial expressions were identical to the other conditions. The spatial behavior alone changed perception. I worked with a teacher named Priya, who was struggling with a student who kept getting in her face during confrontations. He was 16, bigger than her, and clearly using physical presence to intimidate. Priya's instinct was to step back, which made her feel worse and seemed to escalate his behavior. We practiced the occupy response. Next time he stepped close, she stayed where she was, turned to face him directly, and said in a normal voice, "I notice you're standing very close. Is there a reason?" He froze, then stepped back, then muttered something and left. Priya told me later, "I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified, but I did it anyway, and the terror passed, and now I know I can do it." That's the key. You don't have to feel unafraid. You just have to act unafraid long enough for your nervous system to catch up. The body leads, the mind follows. Here's a truth that might hurt. Not every comment deserves a response. Not every criticism deserves engagement. Not every provocation deserves your attention. Not every attack deserves the dignity of a defense. We've been trained to believe that responsiveness is a virtue, that good people listen, engage, address concerns. And it is a virtue in relationships of mutual respect. But in dynamics of intimidation, responsiveness becomes a trap. The intimidator's strategy is simple. Throw out as many hooks as possible and see which ones catch. Maybe it's a jab about your competence. Maybe it's a dig about your appearance. Maybe it's a joke that isn't really a joke. They're fishing. And every time you bite, every time you explain, defend, or even angrily deny, you're confirming that their bait works. Selective responsiveness is the practice of choosing, deliberately and consciously, what deserves your energy and what doesn't. This isn't about being dismissive or rude. It's about understanding that your attention is finite. Every moment you spend engaging with someone's manipulation is a moment you're not spending on something that actually matters. Every emotional reaction you give them is currency they can spend elsewhere. I learned this from a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who studies organizational power dynamics at Stanford. She told me about a CEO she advised who was constantly being undermined by a board member. Little comments in meetings, skeptical looks during presentations, emails questioning minor decisions. The CEO's instinct was to address each thing, to provide more data, to explain his reasoning, to set the record straight. But Dr. Chen suggested something different. Let most of it go, not all of it. If something was genuinely important, address it. But the constant low-grade undermining, starve it. The CEO started treating those comments like background noise. He'd acknowledge them with a nod or a noted and continue with the agenda. No defense, no explanation, no visible reaction. Within 3 months, the board member's behavior changed. Not because the CEO confronted him, because the CEO stopped rewarding him. The comments had always been about getting a reaction. When the reaction stopped, the behavior lost its purpose. Human beings are reinforcement learners. We do what works. If aggression gets results, if it produces visible discomfort, defensive explanation, or status loss in the target, we'll use more aggression. If aggression produces nothing, no visible effect, no status change, no emotional payoff, we'll try something else. You're not just protecting yourself in the moment. You're training them for the future. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Not because you're afraid, but because you've judged the comment and found it unworthy. This requires a subtle internal shift from "how do I respond to this?" to "does this deserve a response?" Most people skip the second question entirely. They go straight from stimulus to reaction, assuming that every comment requires an answer. But you get to choose. You always get to choose. A client named James was in a meeting where a colleague said, "Well, James hasn't exactly covered himself in glory on this project." Old James would have listed his accomplishments, defended his record, gotten visibly upset. New James just looked at the person for a moment and then turned to the meeting leader and said, "What's the next agenda item?" The colleague sputtered. The meeting leader moved on, and everyone in the room understood something. James wasn't playing, not because he was mean, because he was selective. We've been taught that agreement means surrender, that if you concede anything to someone who's pressuring you, you've lost ground you'll never recover. This is one of the most expensive misunderstandings in human interaction. There's a difference between agreeing with someone's conclusion and acknowledging someone's perspective. The first is surrender. The second is strategic intelligence. When you resist someone on every point, you create a dynamic of total opposition. They dig in. They become more committed to their position because it's now tied to their identity. If they back down, they're not just changing their mind, they're losing. But when you find something, anything, you can genuinely acknowledge something shifts. Their threat response drops slightly, their defensiveness relaxes, and crucially, they now have to return the favor. Social norms are powerful. If you give someone something, even something small, even just acknowledgement, they feel an unconscious pressure to give something back. It's not manipulation. It's how human relationships work. Reciprocity is baked into our neural circuitry. The key is giving the right thing. You're not giving them victory. You're giving them recognition, which costs you nothing and buys you enormous leverage. Instead of, "You're wrong," try, "I can see why you'd think that, given what you know." Instead of, "That's not fair," try, "I understand why you'd feel that way." Instead of defending yourself against, "You always mess this up," try, "You're right that this part didn't go as planned." Let's talk about the rest. Notice what's happening. You're not conceding the main point. You're not surrendering your position. You're just not fighting about everything. And by not fighting about everything, you preserve energy and credibility for the things that actually matter. A 2016 study in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology found that when people in conflict heard even partial agreement from the other side, their physiological arousal decreased by an average of 23%. Heart rate slowed. Skin conductance dropped. They literally became calmer, which made them more capable of rational discussion. The person who can lower the temperature while holding their ground has a superpower. Partial agreement is how you do it. A therapist I know named Diane works with couples in high conflict. She told me about a session where a husband was furious at his wife for something she'd done years ago. He'd been holding on to it, bringing it up constantly, using it as evidence that she was untrustworthy. The wife's usual response was to defend, to explain why she'd done it, to point out that he'd done similar things, to argue about the past. Classic escalation. Diane suggested something different. What if you just said, "I understand why that hurt you. I would have been hurt too." Not because you're taking full blame, because you're acknowledging his experience. The wife tried it. The husband literally stopped mid-sentence. He looked confused. Then he said, "Okay, thank you." And the conversation shifted, not because the issue was resolved, but because the dynamic changed. She'd given him something he'd been fighting for, the sense that his pain was seen. And once he had that, he didn't need to fight so hard. People would rather be understood than be right. This is inconvenient for our ego, which wants to be right. But it's true. And when you can give understanding without sacrificing your position, you become almost impossible to intimidate. We spend so much time learning how to enter conversations, how to handle confrontations, how to respond to pressure, but we spend almost no time learning how to leave. This is a massive oversight, because the ending of any interaction is what people remember. Psychologists call this the peak end rule. Our memory of an experience is disproportionately shaped by the most intense moment and the final moment. The middle gets compressed. The beginning and end define everything. Intimidators know this instinctively. That's why they try to prolong interactions. That's why they reach for the last word. That's why they keep talking as you're trying to disengage. They want the ending to belong to them. Your job, take it back. A composed exit isn't just walking away. It's a deliberate, intentional closure that communicates something powerful. I'm done here. Not because I'm defeated, because I've decided the interaction is complete. Before you physically leave, you need to signal that the conversation is reaching its end. Your sentences become shorter. Your voice stays level but takes on a tone of finality. Your body orientation might shift slightly toward the exit, just a few degrees. Not enough to look like you're fleeing, enough to signal that you're preparing to move. Then comes the closing statement. One sentence, maybe two. It states your position, your boundary, or your conclusion without inviting further discussion. I've said what I need to say. We can revisit this another time if things change. This conversation isn't productive right now. I'm going to Step away. I understand your perspective. My decision stands. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I'll take them into consideration. Acknowledgement, if appropriate, then closure. No apology. No over-explanation. No trailing off into uncertainty. Then comes the physical transition. And this is where most people leak power. They hold themselves together during the conversation, but the moment they turn away, they sigh, shake their head, mutter something, or rush out like they're escaping. All the composure they maintained evaporates in the exit. Your physical transition should be as composed as your verbal one. Gather your things at a natural pace. Stand smoothly. Take your first step at a normal walking speed, not rushed, not dragging. Maintain your facial composure until you're fully out of sight. The person watching should see someone who is leaving by choice, not fleeing by necessity. The difference is visible in the body. And then the hardest part, what happens after you leave? Your nervous system is still lit up. Adrenaline is still circulating. Your brain wants to replay the interaction, compose better responses you could have said, text someone to vent, or, worst of all, go back and continue the fight. Don't. The post-exit period is when the ending gets solidified. If you rush back, physically or mentally, you undo the closure you created. You tell your own brain that the interaction isn't really over, which means you stay in threat mode longer than necessary. Give yourself at least 20 minutes of genuine disengagement. Move your body. Change your environment. Look at something that has nothing to do with the interaction. Let your nervous system recalibrate. A CEO I advised had a board member who would corner her after meetings and try to pressure her into decisions she didn't support. She'd hold her ground during the conversation, but then she'd stand there afterward, stuck in the hallway, still engaging. The board member would keep talking, keep pushing, keep her trapped in the interaction. We worked on a simple exit protocol. When the conversation reached its natural end, she'd say, "I've got my next commitment. We'll pick this up if it's still relevant later." Then she'd walk, not run, just walk. Smoothly, calmly, unapologetically. The first time she did it, the board member called after her. She kept walking. He didn't follow. And something shifted permanently in their dynamic. He'd learned that the trap door didn't work anymore. You don't win every interaction by having the last word. You win by having the last composure. The person who leaves centered leaves an impression that no amount of post hoc arguing can erase. Your exit is your verdict. Make it final. So here we are. 7 frameworks. 7 ways of understanding power that have nothing to do with volume, aggression, or domination. Let me reframe them for you one last time, not as techniques, but as a single, integrated truth. Intimidation is a story someone tells about you, hoping you'll believe it and tell it to yourself. The story says you're small, you're vulnerable, you need to prove yourself, you should be afraid. But stories only work if the audience cooperates. You are the audience, and you get to choose whether you stay in your seat. When you freeze the stage instead of rushing to perform, you're not being passive. You're refusing the role they wrote for you. When you ask precise questions instead of defending against vague attacks, you're not being difficult. You're insisting on clarity before engagement. When you slow your tempo instead of matching their urgency, you're not being sluggish. You're demonstrating that their emergency isn't yours. When you hold your space instead of shrinking, you're not being aggressive. You're reminding both of you that you exist as fully as they do. When you choose what deserves your response, you're not being dismissive. You're being a good steward of your attention. When you acknowledge without surrendering, you're not being weak. You're being strategically generous in ways that change dynamics. When you leave with composure instead of chaos, you're not running away. You're writing the ending they can't control. This isn't about becoming hard or cold or untouchable. It's about becoming present. So present that pressure can't find a foothold. So grounded that intimidation slides off like water off stone. So centered that other people's storms pass through you without uprooting you. The people who try to pressure you are not your enemies. They're teachers, unpaid, uninvited, often unpleasant, but teachers nonetheless. They show you where your edges are soft. They reveal where your attention gets snagged. They illuminate the fears you haven't finished processing. And when you can stand in front of them, not fighting, not fleeing, just standing, you're not defeating them. You're outgrowing the version of yourself that they could reach. That's the real victory. Not winning the argument, not making them back down, not proving you're stronger, just becoming someone who can't be pulled into games you didn't choose to play. The next time pressure comes, and it will come because life keeps teaching until we learn. Remember this, you don't have to win. You just have to remain. Remain in your body. Remain in your timing. Remain in your values. Remain in your sovereignty. They'll exhaust themselves eventually. They always do. Storms pass, noise fades, performance ends, and you'll still be there. Still standing. Still you. Not because you fought, because you never left.